government that at some stage of development we should not only care about the economy, we should care about the other values as environment as well. So that's why we believe that in Western nations, in Western states, we should require from the companies, multinational companies, to impose those environmental standards at all stages in production, by which we mean if it's produced in the country, but as well if the things are produced outside of the country, but sold in the country. So basically, let me explain the model. Basically, we think the easiest way to do this would be basically like through some international cooperations. We have already some structures, as for example, European Union or other international corporations. We believe that Western nations can reach an agreement what they deem as proper for environmental standards and cooperate together, create some kind of international control over the things, and then go and check it during the, for example, fabrication in the factories, etc., etc. So, first of all, we want to do this because, why? First, my first argument will be based on the difference of the Western nation from the developing countries and why we should impose it in Western nations. Secondly, I'm going to talk more about the environment, and then I'm going to talk about the impact which is going to make for the selling of goods and for the companies. So first of all, Western nations are more developed, that we are different from developing countries, that we achieved some kind of level in our economy, and we are not officially poor, and we should not only care about economic profits, but as well of the well-being. We believe that living standard is not only economic, they are not only money we earn, it's as well things as, for example, values like liberties, and as well environment, because environment is is good for in average citizen level. It's like for spending leisure time, for example, and good environment is kind of profitable for everyone, as well as for country and for the future generation which are going to take the lead after us. We believe we owe it to them, and my partner is going to elaborate on this. So we believe the environment is valued from each and every one of us. And we believe that at this stage we are here, we have special feature, we are already rich enough to start caring about other things than only economy. Then why, basically? Why multinational companies? Basically because we can have some kind of influence. I'm going to talk now about the way it's going to affect them. So first of all, international companies are selling a lot of products in Western markets. And the products are the most of the expensive products created in the world, and the most of the profitable products, like cars, for example, are sold on the Western markets, which means that's the place when the companies are generating the most revenue they have. So basically, we believe the companies, even though it's gonna maybe be less profitable for them to product things with this environmental standard, because we admit that it can be costly for them. Even though this, basically we believe they're gonna still produce these things because there's their biggest markets, and it's gonna be profitable for them anyway. Because in the developing nations and in the more poorer nations, it's gonna be hard to sell the things as expensively as in Western markets. So we believe they are not gonna just quit and move their market everywhere. As well, we believe that, for example, for the production in the Western countries with better technology than in poorer countries, so these companies still are going to stay with us because it's going to even be better for them to pay more for the products than basically to move all the business somewhere else from some cheaper country who's not taking the environment into account. As well, we believe it's going to be good for the PR if they are going to stick to these environmental standards. We believe that basically these companies, big companies, are always, they're big enough to be known in the world, so they care about the public image they have. They're engaging in some, for example, fundraising and charitable organizations by even creating them outside of the company. So we believe they care about the public, what they're going to think about and going to think about their initiatives. In this way, so we believe that by imposing these standards, environmental standards, they are just going to show themselves as the good companies, the companies that care about the environment, that care about people, and they're going to create a good image and can even sell themselves marketing. Thank you. So now I'm going to move to the question of the environment in general, but before that I can take few ideas.
Sure. The 1990s Kyoto climate talks process almost failed because the US and the EU couldn't agree about whether to use carbon pricing and ETS. What kind of environmental regulation do you think that Western nations will agree on?
Well, I believe in general, Western nations have common interest in environmental regulation. That's why still, even if they cannot agree on every single principle, there are still like environmental global summits, and all the biggest nations wants to cooperate on this and wants to create some common standards for countries. We believe we can do it the same thing for international companies this way by some kind of consensus. We don't say it's going to be easy, but we say it's going to be profitable for the society, and that's worth fighting for. So then I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment in the end. So why we believe in the government side, environment is such important thing. Why should we care about this? Well, we believe that in comparative, we have like just economic development, and we have like this environmental well-being. We believe that economy is not everything, as I said before. We believe the development is more important, that we are more for like not wild capitalism, but more for sustainable development and like changing things slowly. We don't want, for example, the companies to destroy local environment. We don't want them to do some as well things unsafe for the animals or unsafe for the environment, because the environment is good in itself, we believe. First of all, even if we generate like different sources of energy, like sustainable energy as well, we do it all to save the environment for the future generations, and we do it all because we profit ourselves from the environment. Even if we go, for example, fishing in our free time, or if we want to go to the seaside, that's why we, as average human, we are profiting from the good environment, of the sustained environment. So basically, that's what we want to impose. So like basically, for these reasons, we think that we should impose these standards like in cooperation with other nations. First of all, because we are developed enough that we can afford it. Secondly, because the environment is important both for us and for the future generation. And the third thing is the companies will still want to, will impose the standards and will not stop like producing things for our markets, so it's going to be preserved. Thank you for this.
I thank the Prime Minister and welcome Leader of Opposition.
Yes. Madam Speaker, my 2 points are going to be about the efficiency, how this proposal is going to work, and second point is about the damage that is going to be to this proposal. But firstly, in regard to the first government, the main time she dedicated for speech was to tell us how environment is so important to us. No one is arguing about that actually, and to convince why we, the West, should regard why the environment is so important to the West, that it was defending from. Not only that, the fact that you have made it very explain to us how exactly is that going to make the environment better. And this is the main point. The question, which leads me to my first point, whether indeed we, as the West, have the option to enforce those rules that we want to make. Even if we assume that we as the West can get to some environmental standard which all agree upon, we can't really enforce it. Why can't we enforce it upon those other nations? First of all, we're doing that voluntarily without asking the government of those other countries. The Kyoto Agreement worked quite fine because of the fact that the government of the third world agreed upon the standard that they are one that's going to have to enforce it. When we're doing that without asking those governments to enforce it, we don't have a really efficient way. How are we going to do that? We're going to send inspectors despite of the fact that those governments don't want them to do so. And secondly, okay, international corporations have many ways to ignore regulation. How do they do that? They use practices. They use practices. Other companies in order to make sure that you can't follow the line between them and the population, which is much more harder, specifically when you're not working with those governments. So what you're making, first of all, is things don't work. It makes a smoke screen. You feel, oh, that's perfectly fine. We're making a good regulation about international population when you're actually doing nothing that's working. And the fact that this process nowadays is escalated by the fact that it's making the importance of the environment is getting much more bigger to each and every country. But when you does your proposal without get the concession of those countries, you might have a regression because of the fact that you're enforcing things upon them that they're not agreed upon. They might say, okay, for me, I don't want to do any regulation of the environment because it affects those countries. And that leads me to my second point, with the damages, not only the inefficient proposal that you're proposing, but that it has many damages, not only to the West, which will make production much more costly. I'm willing for it to be more costly, but the damages to the third world countries. That's my point. That the fact that you're now proposing a regulation that will make those countries much less attractive to corporation to invest. No, not yet. When you enforce such regulation, you make those countries less attractive, and this is the main reason why countries themselves won't be cooperating with us. But even if magically we will have some sort of way to enforce those rules, a corporation will back up from those countries, and this is problematic because of the fact, two facts. First of all, it will damage those countries financially, which is not sustainable for them. And secondly, because of the fact this is unjust because of the fact that the West is the one in the 200 years that has caused the most damage to the world, and now it's asking third world countries to be the one. They're blaming them for that, and they're asking them to prepare the things that the West have done over the years. Second, you want to apply? Second, still not. Okay, first.
Okay, even you were right, you have not. We still are choosing between doing some small reversible damages to the economy and irreversible damages to the climate. Which is worse? I think that the answer is quite simple.
You're ignoring my whole analysis about the fact that it wouldn't work. They're just going to be using proxies. It's just going to be used as a smoke screen. I felt that there might be even regression. And a big corporation care about their PR and so, and when they will be using proxies and so, they will be much less accountable than the situation we're having now, in which if we're doing agreements, Obama in 2012 in Rio de Janeiro tried to get to a new agreement with third world countries in order to make that agreement much more efficient, because only countries have the ability to enforce such an agreement, and especially not voluntarily actions taken by Western countries, which will only lead to extra backlash with third world countries that have already been paying most of the price for the West up until now, and the damage they have done for the environment. Therefore, from two main points, firstly, it's inefficient. It might lead to regression, not progress. And second point, it will lead to a lot of damages to third world countries, and it's unjust. And therefore, I call you to not close, opposite. Thank you very much.
I thank the leader of opposition and welcome Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay, in my speech I'm going to focus on 2 points. First is how our model is the only way to remain consistent with our environmental policy that was brought about up to this day. And the second thing, how our societies and our nations will actually benefit on that policy. But before that, I would like to rebut one of your arguments. You were talking about making those developing countries less attractive for foreign investors, and therefore it will somehow damage their economies because, well, somehow wouldn't. So it wouldn't do that. It will not going to be that way because all of those developing countries will be affected at the same time. If we are imposing those policy on all the multinational companies that are operating in our countries, well, it's not like that they can escape from the Bangladesh to China or to something like that because it gets more costly producing things in one of the countries. All the countries are affected, so it doesn't happen. Even if it does happen, still, as I said in my POI, we are still choosing between making reversible, relatively small damage to the economies and irreversible damage to the environment, which is much more harder to just get renewed. Okay, so first thing, environment is a global issue. It's not like that if we do care about environment, everything will be fine without other countries caring about theirs. If we are talking, for example, climate change, we need to cooperate on the multinational level. All countries will get involved because even if in the European Union, for example, we have a carbon emissions or something like that, still, if China doesn't approve to this condition, it's more fruitless or less effective than it could be. So we need to somehow convince or force those countries to observe the environmental regulation we would like to introduce. As history proves, it's often impossible to do that in political way. It's often impossible to convince them to sign some treaties or to introduce some laws. So we need to do that in some other way. And we want to do that through the companies that operate in both our countries and their countries. Their companies would have a big impact because, well, they are quite important actors in their economies. A lot of production is being held in the countries, in the developing countries, doesn't observe environmental regulations, and they sell these things to our countries. So if we impose on those companies who operate in our country, for example, to some fines or other administrative regulations, observing those environmental regulations in all of the chains of production, including their firms in those developing countries, well, we actually, not by convincing those countries, but by make things done, but make facts despite of their disagreement, we get things done and we are actually enacting those policies we like to act. So, you are talking that foreign governments that doesn't want to agree, and because of that we shouldn't do that, but actually that's the point. If they agreed with us, there wouldn't be a problem because they would do the same without our, well, let's say, help. So, actually, if we don't do that, the whole of our environmental policy is ineffective because it doesn't matter that we do care about the environment if other countries doesn't care and their environment is harmed anyway, and our efforts are in fact fruitless and all money we spend are just doesn't go. Okay, so the second argument: how do we benefit in that? In introducing our societies will benefit in introducing that by introducing those policies. Okay, as my partner said, the important thing for our societies is not only economic growth, it's not only money, but also broader broader understanding of well-being, which is not only money in your pocket, but also clean air, also no trashes in rivers, in seas, and so on. Also more biodiversity and clean energy and other factors like that. Our citizens, of course, visit their countries and see that there is something wrong. Then they breathe those polluted air and so on. It's the one that's not the most important. It's not the most important thing. By not observing those regulations to the countries, those negative changes to the climate and negative environmental changes actually influences our climate. So we need to do something to stop that. And also remind you that, well, the nature and the biodiversity, the animals and so on are a legacy of the world humanity and not all of these nations. Now we can say that, I don't know, pandas are China's. We want to change people or something like that, but future generations will not perceive that in that way. So we need to. The point is to leave them the world that they can enjoy in a way that we can do now, and we couldn't do that if we don't enact this policy, because there is no other solution to make those kind of observing those environmental regulations, and the damage that would be done without observing those regulations is often irreversible and POI.
When American Apparel, the clothing company, was forced to change their work standard, all they did was just move their workers to contractor companies, therefore actually decreasing regulation.
Okay, so that's what we say. Why we specifically what there is motion is all chains in companies. So they can move whatever they want. It still doesn't change anything. We cannot force that, and we can still force them to observe those environmental recognition. Also, you were talking about damage that would be done to those countries. Well, let's imagine the world in 50 or 100 years. Those countries will not be developing but developed, and they will just want to have account of their history, and they may see us, our societies and our nations, are those who just came there and use their cheap labor and destroy the environment, or like they use colonists in past ages, or they may see us as those who, maybe against their will, but promoted the environmental virtues and brought the progress and, well, actually make their well-being better. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and welcome the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Is it okay if I speak for here or
Wherever it's comfortable.
That's one cool. Next up. Under PROP's proposition, what we're getting is actually more damage to the environment through lack of regulation, damage to the Western economy through rising prices, and also, as Mal told you, damage to the third world country for actually losing their main source of economy. Obviously, PROP didn't actually deal with what we're telling them, which is a real shame. I'll have 2 points. I'll talk about how the process is already happening, which will obviously answer to the whole environment is good. We have no other option. Obviously, we have other options, and they're not for forcing and regulating. And secondly, I'll talk about the damages and how harmful this will actually be to the environment, to the economy. First, 3 points of rebuttal. Look, they completely ignored more analysis of why this won't work. And he gave you and we're giving you the example in my POI of clothing companies and the sweatshops that happen. Okay, look. When American Apparel, when Nike was actually forced to change their workflows so they'll fit Western standards, all they did is they moved their sweatshop workers to contract to proxy companies, which actually meant worse conditions for the workers for once, and secondly, worse regulations. That's why we got people burning in flames in those down crumbling buildings. That's why we got absolutely no regulations who is doing it. So it doesn't matter, and you didn't understand, it doesn't matter that it's happening in all countries. The point is that it's not really gonna happen. The what do we call them?
The corporations aren't going to have any incentive to do that if they've already succeeded and actually managed to just move their workers to contracting companies and didn't get any backlash from that on the legal stance. We do think there's another way of doing it, and that's through the power of the people and the power of the consumers, not through enforcement. Okay. As to the point of consistent with the policy, they're saying that, oh look, this will actually make those countries that aren't signed on the Kyoto Agreement and such, to actually improve their standards. And I'm asking you, why? In God's name, why? If you actually went and said, look, this Western corporation is actually having a lot harder time right now, how about maybe we as the Chinese government should just actually down-regulate the regulations that we already have to help Chinese companies, because then it will be less hard for Chinese companies to compete in the global market. I don't understand what you're doing. If you're not involving the governments, like Mohammed said, you're actually harming the environment, okay? On the contrary, you actually give the local companies an incentive to be competitive edge and actually have much worse regulations for the environment. And as for the benefits, look, I'm going to answer that in my question, but really no other solutions. We agree the environment is important, but the solution is not where you're saying it should be. Look, and why is the solution not saying where it should be? And this is me moving to my constructive. Because this process of actually buying more green, buying more eco-friendly products, buying products that haven't been tested on animals and such, this is actually happening today, okay? We've got people who are buying green, we've got people who are searching for this, we've got people who are actually, don't clap, you'll get this, right? We've got internet movements, we've got Facebook campaigns. The only reason that American Apparel, for example, has actually agreed to change their policies, to take responsibility, to take action, is because they were actually met with a student, with the US students outrage, and actually they said, we're not going to buy anything from you guys unless you change those standards, unless you do anything else. We've got options of boycotts, we've got options of campaigns, we've got all those campaigns. We see anti-fire working, so we don't understand why you think that we have to enforce it in order for this to work. Furthermore, not only that we don't just need to enforce it because it's happening in a different way, enforcing it will actually be a lot more harmful. And before I get to that, I will have to take a second.
On one hand, you're saying, well, enforcing it didn't change anything. On the other hand, you say that the campaigns are actually helping. How do you know they're actually not just moving it to subcontractors?
Okay, and I will answer in my point, and this will actually answer Frob's supposed benefits. Look, Mola talked to you about the smoke screen that happens. When we give responsibility to the government, when we're saying, okay, look, this is something the government agreed upon, this is something the government has to enforce, this is something that is the government responsibility, we stop taking responsibility as a private consumer. And at the end of the day, the private consumer, and that's organizations of consumers, that's how it's working. So therefore, it is mutually exclusive. It's not the same thing, okay? Because when we trust the government, we actually want to act and work through a second-hand means. So we actually go, okay, maybe we'll demonstrate. So you can say, maybe we'll demonstrate against the government, but that won't work because we already explained to you, the government doesn't have any leverage against those companies. Okay, we don't think the supervision will work. We didn't get a proper explanation of how the supervision will work, who these people are going to be, why should they actually do what they're going to do, who will they cooperate with when they come there. Okay, when the leverage on those companies is through the market, then it's more direct. I think it's more direct. It's actually me or a group of my friends not buying those products. This is actually hurting in their pockets of those corporations. This is hurting their image that you guys talked about. That is so important. Yes, that's what we want. We want that image to be hurt. However, when we get the government and we're saying this is the government's responsibility, this is the government not even enforcing the regulations well enough, what we actually get is an absolute smokescreen, in which case, right? Okay? In which case, we actually get to a situation where we trust our government to do what we as consumers do better. Okay, the government doesn't actually know how to regulate. The government doesn't actually have a lot of interest to get so deeply involved in other countries' territories, in other countries' laws, in other countries. Yeah, they don't really have a lot of things to get involved in other countries. just for the environment. We don't see the environment taking such a lead role in any other government policies and other government things like the Kyoto Agreement, things like what we see in Japan. We're not really the government isn't really enforcing them. There are many attempts, but we see that the only real way to do this is through the market, is through the consumers actually saying, look, this isn't working for us. So basically what we're telling you is this will not work because the corporations have every incentive under the sun and absolutely no damages in actually making some kind of smoke screens like through contractor companies. Okay, this will actually damage the Western economy, obviously, because it will raise prices. And thirdly, like we explained to you, this will damage the third world country that we do have a responsibility for. It will just be more harmful to the environment, to the economy, and there are other ways to achieve this. We call you to a close.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and welcome Member of Government.
May I start? Basically, what we heard from the first table of opposition is three things: that we're doing damages to those countries. Those countries won't agree, and Facebook campaigns are going to solve every problem in the world. Why is that not true? I'm going to explain to you in 3 whys. Why this policy will work, why everybody will agree to this policy, and thirdly, why will every economy in this process be better off? But firstly, a couple of points of rebuttal. They were talking a lot about subcontractors and how everybody can just hide around the subcontractors, and as Nike did in one of their legal cases. Well, it's not hard to extend the supply chain that under which we enforce to include subcontractors as well. Well, if we only regulate that by Facebook campaigns, Nike can say, whoops, we didn't know about that subcontractor, so it really doesn't have anything to do with us. So under our policy, when we include subcontractors into our policy, we actually get some regulation over those subcontractors, while on their side of the house, they're simply giving them deniability. Second off, let us just examine the first thing: why will it work? How does this happen? Why didn't Kyoto and Rio work? Because the countries themselves had to implement a policy. Now, what we're doing under our own model is taking an existing policy. It can be a common policy or a policy of each country individually. It doesn't really matter, though a common policy as what was presented by the first house would be better, but it doesn't really matter in the grand scale. We apply that policy and say, if you want to enter our market, you need to comply with this through the entire steps of chain of production that you have. And what we do is send investigators, inspectors, whoever, to check that supply chain to the base. The company needs to register the supply chain, and we are going to check it out, so that the supply chain is in order with our standards. Now, the country where the supply is happening, where the production is happening, didn't implement a single thing. Didn't have to implement a single thing. And the companies are not looking at the basis of where should I base production in order to have the most benefits, but are looking at the markets themselves, because they need to comply with the standards of the markets and not the countries where they're supplying. Thus, in order to enter a market, they need to coordinate their entire supply chain with it. That means it doesn't matter where they're producing. Any country in the world, it doesn't matter. Because the market is what is important to which standards do they need to comply afterwards. Because, as we all know, Western markets usually have higher environmental standards than the less developed countries, as we have all established in this. So this is why it's gonna work, because the Western markets become the criteria of of environmental standards and not those countries themselves. And that brings me to my second point, why everybody will agree on this point. But before I go on, wouldn't you agree with it?
But you're not telling me, and please do tell me, why would those corporations want to abide by the criteria of the Western markets if we easily explain to you that they can pretty much just walk it away?
They cannot just walk away when we include subcontractors into their chain of supply and just regulate the entire thing to be in order with the Western markets. That's the whole point of today's proposition. They cannot walk away from this as they can walk away from Facebook campaigns and boycotts. Because if you don't comply with our market, you're not going to enter it, period. And this is the most efficient regulation. Now, why everybody will agree to this? Because the third world countries, the ones that were presented to have such a bad laws of economy, are actually not going to lose anything. Because every other third world country will have the same regulations, because the Western markets are the ones dictating the regulations, not the countries themselves. So it doesn't matter where you produce, it matters where you're exporting. And why won't the companies simply move the production back to the Western countries? Well, firstly, because resources are cheaper, because human labor is cheaper, and because accommodations are cheaper. The only thing that is similar are the environmental standards. The whole cost of production in the end is still cheaper than if they would move it back to the Western countries. So the third world countries are losing nothing at all, while not having to do anything at all.
On that point.
Before I move on.
So given that it's cheaper to dispose of waste responsibly in countries that have infrastructure for that, it is true then that moving to a country with infrastructure whereby you can pursue these environmental policies is cheaper, so you're actually likely to get out of those markets.
Yes, of course, it is cheaper in the countries where it's easier to dispose of this. That's what brings me to my third point. And this is how the third world countries will benefit themselves. Because resources and human labor and everything like that is still cheaper in those countries, the multinational companies will be incentivized to invest into infrastructure in order to be able to dispose of such material in the third world countries. Thus, the third world countries actually benefit with the infrastructure for a sustainable industry that will keep them on in the future. The multinational companies will actually have an incentive to invest even further, even because of the Facebook campaigns, because they can actually put a brand ecological on it if we run it in unison with the regulations themselves. And how the Western markets themselves will benefit as well is that this will basically increase the price of production, which has two possible outcomes. Either the prices of multinational corporation wares rises, thus we get a better competitive market, because the smaller industries will be able to compete with these huge companies that are mass producing very cheap things, or it decreases the profit margins of these companies, which affects the wealth distribution and thus levels the playing field for everyone even further. And that is why, because we see only benefits on our side, because it is effective, because everybody will agree with it, because everybody will benefit from it. Please propose.
I am thank the member of government and welcome member of opposition.
Good. As you may be able to tell from my slightly charming Australian accent and later from Kate's interesting Southern American drawl, we are from two countries whose head of state either does not believe in climate change or whose Congress does not want to pass any legislation about climate change. In a shocking twist then, the extension that you're going to hear from us will have two parts. First of all, we're going to look at what the negotiation process the government wants looks like, why it's likely to fail, and how it relates to other environmental negotiation processes more generally, e.g. to try and stop climate change with carbon taxes or nuclear energy, etc. And secondly, a point which I call alienating the global south, or why this decreases the quality of environmental regulation and policy in places like China and India, and why it massively undercuts their development strategies and causes huge amounts of suffering. Our rebuttal will be integrated. On to the first point then, about negotiation processes and treaty outcomes. This is really important because the government bench said that in order to make sure there is some kind of standardization that we can agree on this, we need to go through some kind of international legal process. Let's have a look at a few of the ones we've done in the past and if they've worked or not. Kyoto. Kyoto was in some respects a success, as our opening pointed out, but in many other ways as well, a failure in the sense that China disagreed that they had any obligations to, deal with the environment. This later changed, no thank you, with the Copenhagen summit, i.e. 2007, where the global south, i.e. China and India, said we have some obligations, but not that many. That also failed, and instead of having some kind of international legal outcome, you had what was, no thank you, a joke political accord. This may seem like a bizarre international theory lesson. It's really crucial for two reasons. First of all, because it illustrates that there are structural reasons why different countries across the globe have massively different views about environmental policy and regulation on different axes. But secondly, it shows you that this kind of negotiation process almost always fails, and by buying into it, you're perpetuating the myth that that's how we should get improvement in environmental policy. No, thank you. A few things we get when we make this, in light of this talk set. No, thank you. We think it's highly likely that there's going to be massive disagreements about everything from the big issue tickets, as in whether or not these countries should be subject to carbon pricing or emissions trading schemes, right down to the small things. Example, the EU has massive environmental regulation related to complex things relating to infrastructure, whereas a country like America or Australia simply doesn't. That also varies a fair bit. So when the farming party in Australia gets in power, they gut all that regulation and it changes a fair lot. That's important. But crucially as well, in light of the way this process is going to work, there is the threat of regulatory capture by interest groups. Because what we're talking about is a kind of fairly long agreement. It's unclear if China and India can attend. If not, probably a bit offensive. If they can, probably means it can be quite a long process. No, thank you, but equally the same. Most international legal negotiations allow NGOs, some of which are MNCs. So the Nikes of the world are actually able to attend this. At those talks, they will give the case or not for abandoning certain kinds of regulation. We think further, no thank you, what that means is that for the sake of the debate to actually work, we need to assume that we actually do get some kind of outcome. What we can say, however, is that's going to take a really long time, 10 years, which is debilitating. I'll get to the reason why that's bad in a second, but it's going to be a patchy outcome. It's going to disproportionately affect certain countries. It's going to focus on some arcane infrastructure and not others. Where interest groups are able to engage in capture, it might mean that, no thank you, Nestle gets away scot-free because it doesn't apply to dumping cocoa beans, but does apply to dumping waste, etc. But crucially, even if you find none of that persuasive, they wanted to have an incredibly long, by necessity, either a very undemocratic or an incredibly long treaty negotiation process. In that time, what you are wasting, and this is the crucial thing, is time that could be spent focusing on actual issues to do with climate change. Their policy is a massive red herring. It's trolling the international community politically and legally. Because we all agreed in this debate, no thank you, that we had to do something about climate change. We just thought if we wanted to use this limited political capital we had to try and come to some kind of agreement, that should be better spent talking about things like whether or not we should fund the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank to have less dirty coal for the developing world, or things to do with carbon pricing. No thank you. Not how much Nike should have to be subject to regulation in the third world and the intricate processes that flow on from that. So we think the harms, therefore, are one, a policy or an outcome that doesn't work at all vis-a-vis what they expect, but two, the harm which wins us the debate in and of itself of screwing over our ability to actually get proper regulation and policy agreement with regards to international climate change more generally. No thank you. Second prong, which I call alienating the global south, or please don't piss off China that much and kill its people, guys. It's first of all worth recognizing that this policy is extremely condescending. Because what it implies is there isn't a good reason why China and India and Bangladesh are pursuing policies like that. It sort of implies that they just forgot to regulate with the environment because their policymakers weren't quite good enough? We think there was probably a reason why they did that, and that's because the international economic system structurally disadvantages them, forces them to do things like sell textiles and agricultural exports. And moreover, they've inherited a system whereby they believe quite rightly that the West has caused the vast majority of emissions and should therefore be responsible for it, and it's therefore not their fault. Crucially as well, though, they wanted to have their cake and eat it too, because they were the team that said this isn't going to have that many costs in many places, but they were also the team that seemed to apply this fixed climate change, or environmental issues more generally. If you're going to make claim to a massive benefit like that, you have to recognise that it hurts someone. Here's the reason why it hurts the Global South. It hurts the Global South because people like Nike are just going to massively increase the cost of their goods in the Western countries where they stay. Because although they are often pseudo monopolies, there are other crappy shoe brands, etc., which also try and sell shoes relatively cheaply, which means they're going to pass off the cost at the first stage of sale, which means they're going to pay their sweatshop workers even less, which means they're going to try and lobby or engage in nefarious tactics, as our opening told you, even less. But what we say is you massively alienate these countries because you may not invite them to the talks. If you do, you're saying your development policy is wrong, and even if you're saying it's not wrong, you're circumventing them. What that means then is that you have a host of nationalist politicians and politicians more generally in these countries who are, with regards to the specific legislation we're talking about here, the environmental policy more generally, saying bugger it. There has been enough done already. We don't need to have more complex environmental policy, even where it's easier, even where it's appropriate, even when you can actually get it done. They're going to buck past by saying, well, the West has decided what we need to do. We need to do no more. We're not going to engage in your talks about climate change or your talks about treaty processes. What that means then is that you massively decrease the ability for those countries to do things like decrease the use of dirty coal or engage in other international legal negotiations that we want. On economic development, you are going to undermine their development strategies. You are going to make it such that sweatshop workers cost more, if nothing else. You're going to mean they don't have control over how they develop, because if nothing else, what this does is it takes power away from those countries and says, we are the ones to determine how and where your economy lags. We think often central planning is really important in certain economies in Southeast Asia, which want to say we're going to focus here and not here. They undermine that. We are very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and welcome the government whip.
Dear Madam Speaker, so firstly, I would like to divide my speech in two major points. I will be answering the question, why will this model that we're proposing be effective? And secondly, I will be talking about why will this benefit all the stakeholders in the short or in the long term. So let me just start with why will this be effective? We have the first opposition coming up and saying, this will not be effective because the governments don't have the power to enforce this, and because it is not going to, there is no link between what we are proposing and saving the environment. So to this we say, firstly, the governments can do that because they can regulate their own market, and they're going to have regulations on the market for everyone that wants to enter that market, in this model specifically for the multinational corporations. And secondly, we're explaining you, by regulating all of the levels of chain in the production in these multinational companies that we know are really disobedient when it comes to environmental legislations, we believe that we will actually be helping to reduce the damage that is done to environment every day, and even if we do that by little, we believe that we have succeeded. Then we have the second opposition speaker coming out and saying, yes, but they have contracting companies, and therefore they can hide. To this, my partner says to you, no, we can also include them in the chain of regulations, and therefore that problem also is resolved on our side. So we are saying by that we have solve the problem of how we are actually going to regulate this, because it will be based on our own market to everyone that wants to enter. And secondly, we will actually be decreasing the damage, which we believe is good because we'll be saving a lot of the planet. Then we have the second opposition coming up and saying we cannot reach an agreement. There is no use in trying even to reach an agreement. Why? Because everything up till now has failed. We believe that we should look the other way and hope that we have find another way to solve it, and multinational companies can do whatever they want because they're too strong and they're too big. To this, we disagree. As we already explained to you, is that we don't need a necessary agreement that goes worldwide. We believe that firstly, agreement between the Western countries would be good. But even if that fails, each country is a market for itself. Each country can have their own market and they can have regulations on their own market. So we believe that each country could put regulations on their own market. Moreover, we already know that the European Union has a strong environmental policy. We believe that the European Union very often agrees about things because we have a strong European Parliament and a lot of European bodies. So we believe even if just European Union agrees upon the regulations that we will set on the market, we have this whole huge market in the world that is actually posing regulations. And we believe by that, we are decreasing the damage that these multinational companies are doing in third world countries when they can actually afford to do that. By that, we're decreasing the damage that is done to the environment and decreasing the damage that is done to the world. And we believe that because of that, everybody's happy. So we believe that on this point, our point still stands, and this will be effective even if just the European Union agrees and let's say America decides to go on and agree. We don't need an international law process, as they were saying, because as we said, each country can decide this upon their own, and we believe that we definitely should not look the other way, and we definitely should not say that this is too hard, therefore we will ignore the problem or try campaigns, boycotting and stuff like that, because we see that boycotting is, as the first opposition said, we already have boycotting, but did the problem go away? No, we did not. In the first opposition, they actually had this idea that first they were telling us there is a problem, but we are not solving it right. On the other hand, they were saying the problem is already being solved by having Facebook campaigns. We believe that this is a contradiction, and we answer to the both points why they are not still standing. Now, moving on to my second point, why will this benefit every stakeholder? So we believe if the cost rises, as my partner already explained, well, then the third world countries, we do have enough money to face a slightly higher cost on clothing, on some food. We believe that that is not something too much that we have to take on if we want to save the environment. We believe that secondly, here we have multinational corporations that are right now doing basically whatever they want to do with the environment. And we believe, yes, they will have to suffer because of our policy, but we believe that that they will have to suffer is going to be good in the long term because we will save the environment, and therefore we are not going to destroy. They are not going to destroy themselves, the earth for everybody else, and therefore we believe that this damage that they are going to suffer is good in this case. And thirdly, we were talking about third world countries that are, and we believe that by having this policy on our markets, the multinational companies, that are working and producing in that countries are going to actually have to be careful about what they do in those countries. They will have to actually care, and they will have to, if they want to come to our markets, because our markets, actually European Union, are so good that so big and so beneficial for them. They will actually probably have to obey these regulations that we pose on them. And secondly, we believe that by that, in this country, third world countries will have less damage. We will be able to invest in their sustainable development, because if you want to produce there or in any other country, they will have to invest into a more sustainable development of those countries. I mean, and therefore we believe that we will benefit the third world countries by that. And we believe that even if those countries have different environmental laws, have different regulations, those regulations apply to those companies in those countries that are local or that are actually meant to export to some other markets and not the Western ones. Yes?
You're not answering me. You're saying that if they want to come to our markets, they will answer our criteria. I'm telling you, they will want to come to your market, they will pretend to answer your criteria, and will not actually do so.
Thank you very much. The only example that they actually set us with how they will avoid is by having contractors. We already explained you that we will include any contractors that they will have work with them into our chain of inspections. Because of course they are not going to be able to hide through all the inspections of every single level in their production. Now, going on to why this will benefit the third world country. So we have disclosing opposition saying, but this will have a strong impact on them. They're not going to be able to work as well. They don't respond at all to our point about how multinational companies will have to invest in the third world countries if they want to produce there and be on our markets. They don't answer on the point that they will invest in the infrastructure in the third world countries, and then if they will want to actually benefit from those countries and export, come to our markets and sell those things. So we believe that because this will be effective, even if just one world unit agrees upon it, because it will save the environment, because it will benefit. The third world countries can do it, the multinational companies should not do it, and the third world countries are going to be sustainable and therefore working in the long term, and we believe that that is why this is important and we are trying to propose.
I thank the government whip and welcome the opposition whip.
Ladies and gentlemen, on opposition, we're very happy to concede the idea that it is important to protect the environment for future generations. We're also very happy to concede the argument that every country in the world has some responsibility in doing this, right? That's why we think it's funny to go about this in such a way that excludes a good half of the governments in the world from the conversation, right? We think what you do here is you undermine the authority of certain governments and their ability to lead in the way that they choose. You undermine their ability to develop economically while trying to introduce these policies that they will be hostile to at first and that various different countries will try to circumvent. Two things in summary, right? First of all, we're going to talk about how this policy takes power away from countries outside the West, and make sure that things end up worse for them in the long term for the people living there and for the environment. And then secondly, we're going to talk about how this motion disadvantages and prevents future effective environmental policy. So first of all, on this idea of taking power away from countries outside the West. So what we get out of opening government is that in the West, we recognize lots of things are important to sustainable development, including having some responsible economic policy, right? I think first of all, coming from the West, we've benefited from being able to develop very quickly without having to have any regard for these environmental policies, right? So it's unfair to then turn around to other countries who haven't had that advantage in developing and tell them, no, you have to develop in a certain way that we deem appropriate, even though we never had to follow those rules, right? I think that's deeply unfair. Furthermore, as James told you in his speech, it undermines the plans these countries may well have had for their own development, right? We think some countries do make decisions to develop in certain ways that are environmentally sustainable. Other countries think quick development now, raise the standard of living, environmental stuff later. We think it's not our job to decide whether or not those countries are allowed to pursue those policies by forcing multinational corporations to do certain things they might otherwise want to do, or in the worst case situations, actually leave those countries entirely, right? Because I pointed out in a point of information that it is more difficult to follow environmental policy in a country that does not have adequate infrastructure set up for you to pursue that policy, right? In response to that, we get the idea that multinational companies are likely to invest in infrastructure. Two responses, right? First of all, even if they help some countries, we massively disadvantage the countries that are worst off in the instance that it's cheaper to just completely abandon a country that has no infrastructure than to actually try and invest, right? Furthermore, we think companies love to cut costs somewhere. So if they have to make these kind of differences in infrastructure for environmental reasons, we think they're going to cut the wages, the salaries that they are offering people, right? I think that massively, massively hurts people on the ground, because then you get a lower living wage in those countries. It becomes very difficult for people to achieve living standards. We undermine their attempts to develop at every single stage, right? So that's deeply, deeply unfair. All right, no thank you. So then we get a lot of information about why we target international companies, the fact that they have lots of market saturation. In response to this, we'd like to point out that there are lots of countries that are not in the West that have multinational corporations operating in them that we're apparently, or we've been led to assume aren't being invited to the table, right? So let's say we're excluding China, we're excluding India, we're excluding Bangladesh, right? I think these are countries that actually have massive economies that aren't being invited to this bargaining table, or if they are, we think they have a very different set of priorities when it comes to looking at the environment than we do. We think, frankly, countries like the USA have a very different set of priorities than we do, right? So I think it's very unlikely that we actually achieve any kind of agreement in these talks, right? And James proved to you two things, right? Or we discussed like two ways in which these talks go, right? Either we have a long and protracted process in which lots of concessions are made, companies are able to like get involved in this process because they have lots of lobbying power, particularly in countries like the USA, right? Like companies have a very like powerful role in lobbying certain government organizations to introduce policies that are agreeable to them. Or we think you get a short but undemocratic process whereby like we very quickly introduce some environmental standards, right? We think that's probably going to be the worst situation in which the standards that we introduce are as low as is possible to please as many people as possible. We think those are the ones that are subject to being manipulated by private companies who have the money to get involved, who can send like people from their representatives to those talks, and that's like really problematic. Okay, so now let's talk about the second point, this idea of disadvantaging and preventing further effective policy. But first, I will take over.
Okay, so I feel that the opposition doesn't recognize the difference between the agreement like Kyoto, which the governments are imposing something on themselves, and the agreements when they're imposing something on the companies, so it's in their mutual interests.
Okay, right. Like, yes, we would much rather have a policy where governments are having to impose standards on themselves, right? They're agreeing certain ways in which their development should proceed. They're saying like certain things they're willing to enforce. We think at the point where you allow a country like or you allow a group of countries like the EU who have very high environmental standards to tell Bangladesh you have to do a certain thing, right? Or tell these companies operating in Bangladesh they have to work in a certain way. We think you undermine Bangladesh's ability to make decisions about what they're happy to do, right? If you force companies out, like we told you you probably will do, or if you hand over power from the government to multinational corporations, you undermine the government at every level, and that's what's problematic, right? Like, we agree there's the same problem. We don't agree on the same solution. Okay, that leads quite nicely into this point about like damaging future effective processes, right? No, thank you. So we get out of proposition this idea that like it's fine if we make the global south suffer because it's good for the environment long term. Like a couple of responses to this. First of all, we don't think that countries are willing to make these kind of concessions, right? We don't think, no, thank you. We don't think that's going to happen. But furthermore, we think it's pretty ridiculous to have Western nations say, we don't have to make any sacrifices, but you do. You have to redirect your budget to certain areas because if you want to appeal to multinational corporations, you have to set up these kind of infrastructures, right? Or like we're going over you at every different level and handing over more power to private companies than we are to like democratically elected governments or like people who have legitimacy in their state, right? We think like, frankly, there's going to be quite a lot of hostility in these countries to the countries that have made these arrangements and set these tariffs. We think what happens then is you damage this kind of like long-term, the long-term chances for any kind of environmental development from the state down, right? Because then you can hand over any responsibility to introduce effective environmental policies. We also think like there are ways certain companies will benefit in ways that other companies will not. So there's no way in which like you get a policy that is effective in protecting the environment, and there's no way in which you have any kind of political will in the countries that suffer most from doing this, right? So because these kind of companies are profit-driven, and because they exist to exploit people like where possible, we think this motion is incredibly flawed. It makes like the people who are at risk most, like suffer most. We beg to oppose.